I saw in some museum gift shop,
Yeah.
someone had produced like high quality 3D resin sculptures of all like the critters from Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. So there
Oh
was
my
like
God.
like the Dr. Seuss like guy
Yeah.
popping out of the egg and the weird like bellows trombone pig and all that. And they looked so awesome. And they started at like $500.
Oh, I'm sure.
I was about to
Yeah.
say, I'm shocked that we don't own any of these, but
Yeah.
now I understand.
I wondered
Yeah.
if with the advent of 3D printing or just like toy culture, maybe you could
Yeah.
get cheaper versions of these things, but they basically cry. I want a desk covered in all those little like guys. They're adorable.
Oh, I would do it. I also love that Bosch was painting this world in which everything was the enemy, right? And we're always kind of surrounded by demons whom we have to resist, and their kind of seductive allure. And I sort of love taking that back as sort of inviting the demons in instead of struggling against them.
Did the Bosch class that you're teaching emerge from the book project on Paradise?
Yeah, that's how I got interested. So it's about Paradise, Arcadia, and the Golden Age. And I'm thinking of these as kind of narratives of thwarted desire. And so Paradise, and as separate entities, right? So in the Renaissance, one thing that they tend to do is start conflating them, right? They're synonyms, right? The Golden Age equals Paradise equals Arcadia. And this is not quite true if you go back to their origins. And so I'm tracing kind of how they became, sort of after Benjamin, collective dream houses, like things we build in the mind when we can't build them in reality. And the desire behind Paradise is about certainty. It's wanting to live in a world that can be reduced to only a few rules, only a few possibilities, and that produces abundance out of those possibilities. And Arcadia is about the desire to have like uncomplicated attachments, like attachments that work, whether between humans and other humans or humans in the natural world. And the Golden Age is about a desire for history to have a shape. And it comes out of that old Works and Days poem from Hesiod, which he narrates the sort of decline, right, of the ages. But each of these has kind of a different set of longings behind them that the world does not have or seems not to have enough luxury in it to provide. And Bosch is one of the central texts in the Paradise chapter.
Hearing you put it, these sort of mythological tropes or otherwise, more or less familiar notions like Paradise or some sort of like a golden era as opposed to a specific golden age in the classical text, as you describe it in these terms of like, well, they're fantasies or they're like landscapes where there's certain elements they combine in certain ways. There are pleasures that are delivered or on offer, but maybe also there are anxieties or terrors around the bend, and how there are these different configurations in each of the three regimes you talk about. Having read this piece and the Freud piece in anticipation of talking with you, and also thinking a lot recently about Klein and object relations, I'm like, this sounds like
let's talk Klein.
Yeah.
I would love to do that.
But these sound like ways of poetically or like culturally describing the emergent landscape of like the child.
Yeah, they sound like splitting.
Yeah, they sound like different sort of way. Like, are we going to be paranoid in relation to, our little like half duck, half alligator guy is going to be jumping out of giant shoes and like shoving trumpets up our asses, which I guess is like a Bosch thing, right? Or are there going to be fountains that give us delicious stuff and everyone can look extremely pink because they're extremely, I guess, happy doing it, like precisely in the ways in which these are phantasmagoric sort of reworkings of animals, objects, everyday things. It really does seem to be like, this is a working through of the emergent object world of the child, and how that also, I think, then will implicate, if we take what object relations theorists say seriously, right, that our attraction to political ideologies, but also like our basic orientation vis-a-vis what we can expect in the here and now world that we share together, right? Is it a fearful place? Is it a playground, right? Is it a sandbox? Can it be redeemed? Like those all map onto or exist as further articulations of these basic sort of regimes that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put. So beautifully put. And it also, we'll get into it, but I think one of the the reasons that I'm so drawn to this particular essay and maybe this particular kind of hinge in Freud's work is because it's about the terms on which any kind of shared reality can be created, and the really painful negotiation of those terms, which is bound up in their pleasure, right? Those things are not totally disseverable. And I'll take issue a little bit with the art bullet points that Freud has in this piece, because I think that he talks a lot about how, art is a way of sort of easing or mitigating the dissatisfaction that we feel with the world. And I guess I find that really suggestive, but also I think it misses the point in a way, which is that perhaps we need ways of cultivating dissatisfaction and the kinds of communal possibilities that come out of a shared dissatisfaction. And I think that that's a very powerful thing that aesthetic representation can do. It can sort of hold that still for us and show it to us in a way that is just not possible in life outside of that sort of experience. So yeah, I mean, I'll credit you, but I may borrow some of this stuff about the landscape of the child because I hadn't thought about it in quite that way before. But splitting is actually something that I'm going to talk about in the Arcadia essay when I get to it. Like how do we build some kind of basis for connection in which people can become real to us? And what is the procedure by which people become real to us? And would attachment work if people could be real to us? And what I mean by that term real is something like what Klein means by the depressive position.
Listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so thrilled to introduce Rebecca Ariel Porte, who is here to talk with us about a big burning question. What is the pleasure principle? Rebecca is a member of the core faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and an editor at Dilettante Army. She's actually been Patrick's and my editor and is a fabulous one. Rebecca is at work on a book about Paradise, Arcadia, and the Golden Age. Who better to talk with about the pleasure principle? And also Rebecca did something that I so appreciated in advance of this recording, because I feel like I spend my entire life going around asking people to do reading, which is she sent us reading. So in addition to selecting our text for today, which is Freud's Formulations on the Two Principles of Mental Functioning, which originally came out in German in 1911, Rebecca also asked us to read some selections from Paradise Lost, which I confess to being a Philistine. I have never read Paradise Lost.
Me neither.
But I deeply enjoyed reading this selection from The Temptation of Eve. I particularly enjoyed all of the different characterizations of the serpent. Like who knew that there were so many adjectives that you could possibly apply to one single snake. And so we are going to proceed today by getting into this text, which is relatively short, and trying by the end of whenever our conversation is over to produce for you something along the lines of a sense of what is it, this principle of mental functioning that Freud calls das Lustprinzip, the pleasure principle. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here today.
I'm just delighted. I almost said my pleasure, but it feels like it's a little too on the nose. I guess it's still on the nose since the title of my book is Unearthly Delights.
I mean, there's something to be said for on the nose. We've just been reading a lot of Freud and fleece. So honestly, like we're really obsessed with noses at the moment.
Fantastic.
Are you ready to get into this text? I have one kind of prefatory note I wanted to make.
Yeah,
and I bet you do too.
Prefatory stuff too.
Do we all have prefatory notes? Amazing. I wanted to do a really quick vocab note as whenever we're doing these sorts of, I mean, honestly, I always have a couple of different psychoanalytic references like open as PDFs on my computer. And I think that it's really helpful to consult them whenever we're doing any of these things to situate myself. And I really liked one tiny section from the International Dictionary of Psychoanalysis, in particular in the way that it is getting at the different senses of Lust and Unlust in German. So I wanted to throw this out before we get into the text. So here is me quoting. The translation of the German Lustprinzip by pleasure principle in English warrants some comment. The German Lust actually has two meanings, that of pleasure, but also that of desire or want. Lust haben auf is the most common expression for to want, to have a desire for. The pleasure principle is thus also the desire principle. The psychic apparatus can do nothing else but desire, says Freud. Similarly, with regard to the rendering of Unlustprinzip as unpleasure principle in the interpretation of dreams, it should be kept in mind that Unlust in German also means aversion. Consciousness turns away from that which occasions aversion. Close quote. And I will say it seems significant that before we have the pleasure principle in Freud's writing, we actually have the unpleasure principle. That's how it actually emerges. Patrick, what is your prefatory note?
I think what I wanted to say was just on the level of to address the abstraction of the piece, and also this is sidebar to bring in people who are not patrons and doing the standard edition with us. So this piece, and I'm sure if we want to pursue more about the context and the historical background and when Freud is writing this and et cetera, we can do that. This is, as you said, a hinge piece in Freud's thought. This is
that's exactly the right word.
A really important sort of pivot for him, an articulation of him thinking through a set of problems in a new way. But also, those problems are recognizably Freudian problems, sort of from the beginning of the Freudian enterprise. And for people who are following along in the standard edition are sort of already probably familiar with this kind of like give and take of speculation that's very, very granular about like hysterical symptoms or various types of pathologies and dysfunction, and like bigger questions of like, why do minds behave like this? What's the act or the trauma or the event that sets in motion this particular type of pathology? And how does it relate to sort of the normal quote unquote operations of mind? With that in mind, what I wanted to say about this piece, just to situate us more broadly, genre-wise, this is an example of what you might call like a meta-psychological speculation, right, in the Freudian oeuvre. People who are longtime listeners may know that we've sort of divided a lot of the different texts that comprise the psychoanalytic body of knowledge into sort of three baskets, right? The first being the clinical, right? How do you deal with patients? What technique, et cetera. Then the psychological or like the meta-psychological, i.e., if in the first instance we're dealing with interventions to help people who come to us with problems, then presumably we would want to have a theory of pathology, i.e. how problems arise, that would exist in some sort of relation to a broader theory of what quote-unquote normalcy looks like. And it might also implicate things, well, two specific things, namely an account of what we could call like mental agencies or aspects of this thing that we call the psyche. This is where the term principle, I think, is kind of helpful for us to think about. Like we're trying to deal with like what's a basic fact of or a disposition. And in this sense, the idea of a principle has like the sense of like a principle that you might find in other organisms. Mm-hmm. Like the way, I don't know, the principle of what's called like positive phototropism, the turning of a plant to the light. So how does the mind, or how does attention, or how does an emergent consciousness sort of, what are the basic principles of this? Is it focusing on something, not focusing on something, et cetera? So that's like metapsychology involves thinking about mental agencies, things that we're going to hypothesize as things like, you know, the ego, the superego, the id, but also about these basic tendencies, principles, rules. The other thing that that's going to implicate is a theory of development. Namely, how do these things come about? How do they change? And I think we can already see that there's a great deal of traffic between the pathological stuff that's showing up and attempting to theorize in a metapsychological mode, well, how did this happen in this one case relative to other people? And then even more broadly, and here we can kind of get into like the third basket too, which is like the applied psychoanalysis. We're starting to talk about like, well, how about other examples of these same cast of characters, i.e. mental agencies or principles producing other types of individual and social outcomes, figures like the artist, etc. So for people who are just sort of diving into this, like this is an incredibly dense paper.
Oh yeah.
Where Freud is like tackling questions that are philosophical and thousands of years old, even as articulated in philosophy. Like, why do we like things that are pleasurable? What is the reality of our experiences, etc. But he's doing it by putting it through a recognizably psychoanalytic sort of procedure that relates to the clinical, that is heavily metapsychological, and that will also involve talking about social expressions of this.
Rebecca, you picked our text for today, and there could have been a bunch of possibilities. You know, we could have read Beyond the Pleasure Principle. I've always liked the section in Civilization and its discontents on the pleasure principle, also in the context of love and religion and the whole extended metaphor of the failed metaphor of the psyche as the city of Rome. Why this essay?
Well, one reason is because I think of it as sort of an ugly duckling in its way. It does feel like it has a kind of hybridity about it, where you can really see the thinking happening. And one reason that I find Freud so productive is that he's wrong quite a lot, as you've discussed on the podcast. But he is so brilliant at giving you methodology that you too can engage in, that you too can modify. And he does lay that out for you as a process. And this is one of these essays where that process is on glorious full display. Like, how do you go about speculating about the structures of consciousness? And this essay, even if you don't find parts of it convincing, as I think we should resist parts of it, is one of these really brilliant exercises in a sort of speculative metapsychology. And it's also Freud in his allegorical mode. Freud is always sort of looking for metaphors. He's looking for ways that we can make vivid and make specific these really gossamer, hard to grasp kinds of things that are locked away from us in many ways, the structures of our own psyche. And so there are a lot of really beautiful, suggestive allegories and analogies throughout this essay. So I love these other pieces too. And I know Beyond the Pleasure Principle is a text close to your heart, Pat. So we really do, I think, want to get into at some point, if people are interested, in what happens after this transitional point, because it's not that the pleasure principle is fully superseded, but it is modified, right? That beyond in Beyond the Pleasure Principle is really important. And Freud sort of shifts the emphasis elsewhere. But the pleasure principle is still lurking in the background, and it's still a partial explanation for how we work as desiring beings, as creatures who have to inhabit a world in which there is a gap between what we can do and what we want, what we can achieve, what we can have, and what we want. And that gap is one that is usefully accounted for by the pleasure principle, even as it does leave quite a bit out.
I really, really appreciated your selection of Milton as a pairing, in part because I realized in reading, this Eve and the serpent exchange, the extent to which, whether or not, as you say, one accepts in part, resists in part, the idea of the pleasure principle and the reality principle, which is the its corollary, right? Of the many Freudian ideas that structure my understanding of my day-to-day existence, the pleasure principle and the reality principle have become really useful shorthands. I often see them or understand them as things that are crystallized in a person. And so like the anthropomorphization of these sorts of principles in a text like Paradise Lost was so useful. When I think about being, Freud's going to talk about daydreams and fantasies, right, as a place where the pleasure principle can still sort of reign even in adult consciousness. I think about the ways in which people in my life fulfill the function of, oh, you are the reality principle. Or like there's an event that serves a deadline is the reality principle. I have to teach the bringing of oneself back to earth and the ways in which there is always a tension in Freud. You must grow up, but you can never grow up.
Yeah.
Is so nicely encapsulated in this. Okay, but let's pick up on Rebecca's point about metaphor and about this being such a richly metaphorical text by looking at the very beginning, which begins with an echo of a metaphor that Freud uses quite a lot, which is the idea of the flight into illness, sometimes the flight into psychosis, and it begins. So now we're reading, and for those of you who are looking at the formulations on the 2 principles of mental functioning with us, this is the very first sentence. We have long observed that every neurosis has as its result, and probably therefore as its purpose, a forcing of the patient out of real life, an alienating of him from reality. So we begin with the flight from reality, which also serves as a really robust reminder that for the beginning that there is such a thing as a shared reality for Freud, right? Even as we're saying this is such a dense text, it's very abstract. It belongs to the metapsychological portion of Freud's corpus. There is a very pragmatic belief that is expressed in here that there is a shared reality and we can partake in it. And that has something to do with health.
I also think that there's something really trenchant about an opening that gives you the stakes in essentially the first line. I mean, I don't think we realize that these are the stakes until later on in the essay. But this idea that people have to struggle with being forced out of reality all the time, right? And what is doing that forcing? And do we want to maintain contact with reality? Would it be good to have a world in which we didn't need the reality principle because everything was agreed upon as reality? So I think it beautifully also encapsulates this way in which the pleasure principle and the reality principle in many ways will have not merely a conflictual relationship, but one in which they seem like they're trying to protect one another.
Yeah.
And that they are speaking different languages. And so that safeguarding, which is the word that Freud uses, is not always going to be perfect. And so we get these kinds of segmenting of different faculties. But the idea, right, is what are the conditions on which we can live in a workable reality, right? What would that look like? And what happens when the only workable, the only viable reality is within the psyche, right? When you have to retreat into that because the reality outside of you is something that you cannot bear to endorse. And It seems to demand your affirmation in this way that is incredibly cruel.
What this essay seems to set out to do is to give a systematic account of like, what is the subject or the person that is developing these various responses: adaptive, maladaptive, ignoring, focusing on, growing, getting stuck, etc., in relation to another term which we have to question, which is namely this reality. And it gets even more sort of twisted when we're like, oh, the subject is we're using the word subject, which Freud doesn't write, but it's the person. We're using subject here in some ways because like so much what Freud is doing is he's alienating and twisting his own terms as he thinks through stuff. But so using this sort of paraphrase exercise of talking about the subject, I think is helpful, right? Because like the subject emerges from a material reality, right? And I guess to gloss that term neurosis that people may or may not, want glossed, or some people may want glossed.
No, do please.
I think for our purposes here, we can think of the neurosis as like, well, I kind of want to just be very casual and be like, it's a hang up,
Yeah.
right? It's, or to use the William Alanson White phrase, which is that I like this. This is a phrase that people associate with the William Alanson White Institute of Psychoanalysis will use sometimes. Like, it's a problem in living.
Yeah.
Right. It's a dysfunction. Right. And so some examples, like we have a certain thing that like neurosis means in the present, or a neurotic means. Generally, it conjures the image of Woody Allen, and this is the reason why it occupies this real estate. But like the neurotic who can't decide.
Mm-hmm.
Do I date this person or do I wait for someone else? Right? Do I want to have kids or do I not want to have kids? Oh yes, like it is sort of like getting caught in a kind of introversion type situation. But of course, there are other types of neurosis more broadly, and that's what Freud is sort of getting at here, which are like mismatches between reality in terms of like expectations of what's going to happen, how the past will be different from the present or the past will not be different, or like relational ones. I don't know. Think about like the mismatch between reality and expectations when you're like, oh, this time, this holiday, this Thanksgiving, I will finally earn my parents' love. And whereas previously they've never failed when it comes to, you know, they've never disappointed at being disappointing. If I just show up with the right date this time and say the right things, then things will work out.
Right. Which is why it can be adaptive to, and here I'm quoting Freud, he says neurotics turn away from reality because they find it unbearable, either the whole or parts of it. So it is in some ways, it's a rational response.
It definitely responds to the stress of the reality or the pain of reality. But then also, like, come Thanksgiving dinner, you're going to be crushed.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's not a realistic, quote unquote, expectation. So in some ways, like, I think part of what I'm trying to get at, it's about like the question of like the mismatch or the how do we bring together like the neurotic distortions of reality that take the shape in various forms, relational, attachment-based, whatever. But how can we, both on the one hand, account for how they come up, two, describe how they affect life in ways that are problematic, and three, also, and this I think the acid test of those first two things is, can we relate that to a theory of psychology, of metapsychology, of the subject's development that will also allow us potentially to explain phenomena like, well, I don't know, why is it pleasant to fantasize about nice things happening to you? And so grounding all that into like a ontology of psychic phenomena and attending to all these specific, very granular dysfunctions, as well as to like different like pathological outcomes or like ways in which it can be sublimated. That's like the stuff of the essay. So yeah, I'm delighted that we're reading this. I think is what I'm just trying to say.
I want to just pick up on one thing that you said there, which is this idea of a kind of spectrum of experience, right? And we could, if we wanted to, conceptualize that from kind of, quote unquote, normality to pathology or something. But what I think the larger sort of lesson for me in thinking of that spectrum is that anything at the right scale looks adaptive and anything at the right scale looks maladaptive. Yep. So a lot depends on kind of our distance from the object. And there are behaviors that we all engage in, right? Patterns, habits of thought that we all engage in that have the potential to partition us off from some kind of shared reality, right? And sometimes those are gestures that preserve us in the short term, but may do more damage in the long term. And sometimes those are gestures that end up being part of the thing that brings us back to reality. That allows us to share a fantasy, for instance, right? Which is it doesn't have to rise to the level of psychosis or hallucination. It can be about sharing a commitment, right? Sharing a type of trust in an object. So this can go in a lot of directions, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean a kind of diagnosis of something. That's the encouraging thing about metapsychology is that it allows us to think about what serves us and what does not together. And it sort of removes that problem of trying to leap immediately to the specific way in which something could go wrong, right? There are ways that this can go right and be preservative.
I am feeling extremely anxious that we haven't read a passage about the pleasure principle,
Yeah,
which
let's
is
do
like
that.
very us to be like, we're really talking about this. We're so excited about it. And I can just see, or I can imagine someone being like, give me the text. Like what it is. Because I want to say in some ways that there is, and you see this stated neatly in Freud's work, a bunch of places that the pleasure principle is in this order: the avoidance of unpleasure and the seeking of pleasure, right? So I want to kind of get that out, and I want to read a section early on in this essay, right after Freud is telling us that his task here is really to figure out how humans, and particularly neurotics, get in relation to reality. Then he gives us a nice chunky passage on the pleasure principle. So let's get that out on the table for a little shared vocabulary. So, quote, in the psychology which is founded on psychoanalysis, we have become accustomed to taking as our starting point the unconscious mental processes with the peculiarities of which we have become acquainted through analysis. We consider these to be the older, primary processes, the residues of a phase of development in which they were the only kind of mental process. The governing purpose obeyed by these primary processes is easy to recognize. It is described as the pleasure-unpleasure principle, or more shortly, the pleasure principle. These processes strive towards gaining pleasure. Psychical activity draws back from any event which might arouse unpleasure. Here we have repression. Our dreams at night and our waking tendency to tear ourselves away from distressing impressions are remnants of the dominance of this principle and proofs of its power. Okay, so I'm just going to say one or two things and then turn it over to both of you. We get this important language, which will recur throughout the Freudian corpus, of the primary process, which will be contrasted to secondary processes. These things roughly correlate to the pleasure principle and the reality principle, respectively. And also, and this maybe seems obvious, especially with the word primary, but I feel like it's worth saying, it's also primary chronologically, right? Developmentally. The pleasure principle comes first. It exists before the reality principle comes into being.
Yeah, something I want to underscore here too is how key it is for Freud and for us reading Freud to think of this, at least at the start, in like the most minimal, parsimonious structural terms.
Totally. Agreed.
Right? Because like when we hear the word pleasure, some people will be like, it's looking out on the fields I've tilled, right? Or for other people, it's going to be, I don't know, a nice cup of chamomile tea at the end of a long day. And then someone else is going to be like, I have a whole bunch of Coke and a giant stack of porn and that's my weekend, right? So like this means different things for different people, right? It's clearly not, whatever pleasure is it bracket that in this sense, in those more sophisticated senses, knowing that we're going to get there. Right now, we're just trying to deal with within the domains of like the basic, again, like elemental parts of the psychic landscape, of the mind, of psyche. We want to determine a principle, like the tendency. I know if we were to talk about like the law of gravitation as a type of principle, right? Things fall down. Like mass pulls things of smaller mass to itself, right?
It's about orientation, right?
Yes.
Like the way that objects tend to fall, right? We tend to be you can't see me, like I'm doing weird things with my hands about like humans sort of tending to be oriented away from one thing, which is just this binary operation. We do have the idea of pain as sort of the opposite of pleasure, but it really is, it's unpleasure.
If anything, what I want to push at here is like for us to think the gesture before the object, or like it's the gesture that, for just reading this, the gesture then decides what the object is. By which I mean, we're talking about a structural vision of a principle and of a movement towards or away that it just basically has those two settings and doesn't necessarily imply any sophistication on the part of the thing doing the turning or any complexity or difference between the objects that may occasion that movement. Just to go back to this again, like sunflowers famously turn towards the sun.
That's
right?
what I was imagining too. Yeah.
And we don't know if they're like getting off on it, though. That's a kind of funny image now that I'm thinking about it. Like the next time you're driving by a field, you're like, oh my God, it's so scary. They're all looking at me too. It's so scary. Oh, all right. Think also about like, I don't know, like they're like small, like I think the scientist is Larry Barcelo, actually, who's done some stuff about like intentionality on a minimal level, right? And if memory serves, part of what he does is like, how do we understand the behavior of very small critters? Like we're talking like one or two, like, you see them under a microscope. I'm not that type of scientist, right? But that basically move across a saline gradient. When there's too much salt in the water, they move away from it. When there's less salt, so they're always sort of moving, and we're like, does it know what salt is? Is it doing this consciously? No, it's just it's reactive, it's reflexive, right? So pleasure then here is understood to be, it's the thing that's turned towards. We can schematize pleasure like in the turning towards, and then unpleasure is the turning away. And here I think like, I don't know, there's a very cool plant called mimosa. It's the one that you can like touch and then all the leaves fold up and it withdraws, right? So that's basic. It's like a structural thing. No complexity on either end. It's moving towards or against, at least for now.
I love how, because Rebecca introduced the garden of earthly delights, you've like really run with the botanical metaphor.
I got in trouble for harassing a mimosa, actually.
Really? Is that possible? They are called sensitive plants.
I have to tell this. Okay, like I have to tell a story.
Wait, this is true?
Yeah.
No, please tell.
I took a course. I had to take a couple science courses in college as a requirement for like, to become a well-rounded instance of human capital. And I took a course called Trees, which was fucking great. I learned a lot about trees, including how to use like tree identification books, but which immediately became useless because now apps just do that. Like, there's completely. It was like, but like we had a lab where we ate fruit, right? Because like that's how trees reproduce and shit, right? Very cool, right? We did do a couple field trips, and the ones that I bothered to attend, one of them was to a greenhouse, and there was a mimosa, and it's a beautiful plant. People can Google it if you want to. If you're driving right now, just take your hands off the wheel, Google a mimosa. It's a very pretty like little fern type thing. And if you touch it, once the underside of the leaves are sort of light olive and the tops of the leaves are very nice pine green, the whole thing folds into itself. And I may or may not have been a little high at the time, but I was on this field trip in this greenhouse. I kept touching the mimosa, and in this kind of way, like this Fort Da thing, I guess. But I was really enthralled by it, and enough so that RTA in the single white, extremely porous T-shirt that he was wearing told me, "You need to stop harassing that mimosa."
And so, what's the takeaway for Freud here?
Look, it's actually Dan off camera just said something delightful. This is the scene. We're talking about pleasure that encompasses both things that are happening there, right? I have a certain type of pleasure principle thing going on where I'm just really fucking enjoying fucking with this plant, right? I'm just really enjoying poking it over and against. Well, at some point, someone's like, my teacher's like, I'm going to give you the C that you deserve if you keep this going, right? Meanwhile, and that's fairly sophisticated, right? I'm sufficiently altered to want to do this, and there's all these things. Why I'm even there in the first place? It's a lab. The plant is foreign, et cetera. It's a cultural scene that's the output of a whole bunch of processes. But on the other hand, here's this plant that's like, ow, and then it waits a little bit. It opens up, and it's like, sun, yes. And then my giant ass finger pokes. It's like, ow, sun, right? So like what we're talking about on the level of the pleasure unpleasure principle is schematically, structurally the through line to both of these. And Freud hopes will do the work of explaining it both in like the space of like a neonate, something that like hard to think about and difficult, and then also something as baroque and bizarre as neurotics like myself.
Well, and I wonder if we should, given that rather masterful explanation of the kind of instinctual persistence of the pleasure principle, think about what happens to it in this developmental narrative that Freud is constructing. Should we look at the next paragraph?
Yes, please.
I shall be returning to lines of thought which I have developed elsewhere when I suggest that the state of psychical rest was originally disturbed by the peremptory demands of internal needs. When this happened, whatever was thought of, wished for, was simply presented in a hallucinatory manner, just as still happens today with our dream thoughts every night. It was only the non occurrence of the expected satisfaction, the disappointment experienced, that led to the abandonment of this attempt at satisfaction by means of hallucination. Instead of it, the psychical apparatus had to decide to form a conception of the real circumstances in the external world and to endeavor to make a real alteration in them. A new principle of mental functioning was thus introduced. What was presented in the mind was no longer what was agreeable, but what was real, even if it happened to be disagreeable. This setting up of the reality principle proved to be a momentous step. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what's happening when that transition from the pleasure principle to the reality principle occurs. And because this is so abstract, maybe think about a few potential examples, like what would that look like maybe in infantile development? What might it look like in kind of the interrupted narrative of a more mature psyche?
So let's take our very structural admitting of both simplicity and complexity definition of the pleasure unpleasure principle is like this binary towards or away from thing and run it through spaces. One thing we might say, or we might think about, that I think is both difficult but absolutely necessary for us to think about this if we're going to think about it with Freud and psychoanalytically, is think about how, well, we as adults with our more sophisticated things like, I don't know, object permanence, a sense of where our bodies end and the other bodies of other people begin, the ability to tell time, right, or at least to measure time, or at least try to, these are all achievements. Right? These are all developmental achievements. And that in fact, what we come from is a not even like mewling, crawling toddler, but a neonate, right? A child that is literally just emerged from a matrix of physical interdependence with the mother. And so now we're asked to conceive of a child, right? And think for one moment, like a child, like a baby, basically also has two settings. Is it rest? Probably sleeping, or could be a little happy, or it is screaming bloody murder. And if we were to think about what's going on with a child, again, noting that the child doesn't have object permanence or subject-object dualism the way we do, well, the neonate, like how does a neonate understand the pain of hunger? Its stomach hurts. Does it understand it as a lack? Well, I don't know. How would it understand, I don't know, having a stomach ache, having too full of a stomach?
Yeah.
Right? Or like the pain that's coming from its stomach on its own when it doesn't get food might feel a lot like the pain that, I don't know, when an asshole uncle pokes it too hard in the stomach. In other words, for the child, what we're now having is a situation, because a child is a thing that will later develop over time, a sense of an inside-outside boundary, we are dealing with a situation in which the noxious stimulus, right, the source of unpleasure, or the source of pleasure, is a thing that can be emerging from itself, or like literally inside its body, or that can be coming to it outside the world. And we, later will become some more sophisticated version of this, but there are a lot of weird steps on the way. And this is why I want to hit the one other term here, which I think a little important to think about, which is this phrase hallucinatory satisfaction.
Yeah.
Very important.
Freud uses this to describe our dreams through more complicated psychic mechanisms. But the image that I think I want us to hold on to here in the context of the example we're talking about, but also with an eye towards like this developmental sort of porousness between inside and outside, between the cohesive reality of an object or its lack thereof. Freud at some points has this line where it's like, well, we can just ask a basic question, like, what's a baby sucking on when it's sucking on a pacifier? What does it think it's sucking on when it's sucking on its thumb? And what might it prefer to be sucking on, but it can't have at the moment? And this at least is a developmental superior thing than just yelling all the time. And the answer is, well, it's the breast, the bottle, whatever it is, it's being experienced in a hallucinatory way, in a way that is not necessarily a direct correlate to the mother, which the child doesn't really understand. The child just engages with the breasts or the hands, etc. Right? So we come from a space in which hallucinatory satisfaction is already a sort of more concretized incipiently stable inside-outside boundary situation. And then we would develop from that.
And we might also think of it as a state in which one understands effects only and causes never. And that's a big part of what the reality principle inaugurates, is the ability to link cause and effect. Sometimes we're really bad at that, and sometimes we don't do it well. But the reality principle is the way that we attempt that comparative move that gives us that boundary between internal and external, which it's worth noting is porous, right? Like he's, for the sake of argument, talking about it as if it's this kind of hard line thing. And in fact, it's much more complicated. And I think Freud knows it's much more complicated than that. The other thing I maybe wanted to ask about is this line that is really suggestive to me. It was only the non-occurrence of the expected satisfaction, the disappointment experience, that led to the abandonment of this attempt at satisfaction by means of hallucination. Like there in a line is the story of how the pleasure principle gives way to the reality principle. But I think it needs a little bit of unpacking. And I go back and forth about how to do that. So I wondered how other people read that line.
I love that we're focusing on this idea of hallucinatory satisfaction, not just because it's kind of awesome. And because I'm obsessed with the interpretation of dreams, which is where Freud starts talking about the whole idea of the unpleasure principle anyway. But because I think it helps bring into view one of the things that I think is so weird and hard about this text. And also one of the things that makes it much more than a developmental psychology narrative or a just so story about how we come of age and put aside childish things, because spoiler, we don't put aside childish things, right? I'm sorry, that's a spoiler for all of Freud. But time is bizarrely unmarked in this essay. And I think if you were reading so many people, and for instance, if you were reading anybody that did child analysis,
Klein,
Freud,
right?
if you were reading Klein, if you're reading Anna Freud, Freud really, other than the little Hans case, and he's not that's at a remove. It's not he's sitting around and analyzing children in the way that the next generation of analysts will. And so we get this idea of kind of this very little baby that's being denied the breast. And then there's these sort of hallucinatory satisfactions. And so on the one hand, it's not like we get to dwell in the pleasure principle until the age of 5 or 6. He's not telling that sort of story, because also this never stops. We're always, because every single time, and there's this wonderful footnote right under what you were just reading, Rebecca, that says the state of sleep is able to reestablish the likeness of mental life as it was before the recognition of reality. Because a prerequisite of sleep is a deliberate rejection of reality, the wish to sleep, right? Not even just that we have to sleep, but the fact that he interprets our needing to sleep as physiological organisms that require rest as a turning away from consciousness, because consciousness involves a recognition of reality. So it's not just this, this baby that's sort of but I want, and thing isn't there. It's every single day we retreat into this. And the struggle to, I guess you could say, and I'm not sure how I feel about this verb, but I'm going to use it and then we can discuss it afterwards if we want to. The need to master the pleasure principle in one's everyday life, and to instead of the sunflower just turning towards pleasure, we have to all the time be regulated by or be accountable to the reality principle. And it's not something that just, it happens, we grow up, and we have done. It's actually something that we have to do fully every night. And then also a recurring image that has come up during this podcast has been the shit you think about in meetings when you're not thinking about what is actually happening in meetings. Maybe just because like in a world where there are no universal experiences, like that's maybe a universal human experience is like, I don't want to think about what's happening in this meeting. The drifting away, right? The taking refuge into fantasy, in daydreams, right? And so on the one hand, the reality principle does overcome, and Freud uses this word, which I think of as a theological word. There's a supersession of the pleasure principle by the reality principle. But on the other hand, those primary processes, they persist, they remain.
A scholar named Ray Tarada, I don't know if you know her work.
Yeah, she's wonderful.
So I really love a book of hers called Looking Away, after a bit of Nietzsche that says, looking away shall be my only negation. And it's about why people turn their heads to look at the colored sunspot on the wall instead of acting in the world. And this kind of act of looking away, as she argues, is about the pressure to affirm a reality that has no place for you, that does not welcome you, that is in any way kind of centrally alienating. And I think that the pleasure principle is very much active in this act of looking away, right? Not just kind of ambivalence about the world, but rejecting without action, which seems to me germane to kind of the processes involved.
What I'm thinking about goes in sort of, well, as ever, in two directions, but one of them is just to answer the question you posed earlier, just to be glib about it, like this line where Freud basically says, the non-occurrence of the expected satisfaction then proves that we need something more than hallucinatory satisfaction, right? To spin this out explicitly, right? In the example of the baby, well, baby is hungry, baby was fed, baby would like to eat more because that was nice, but it's not going to get fed, so it sucks on the thumb instead, and then eventually falls asleep. But then it is woken up by being hungry again on the inside, and now suddenly the hallucinatory satisfaction of the thumb is not enough. Just thinking about that in the second dimension, it's like to map onto, I try to think of adult analogies of this that indicate like a similar kind of give and take, or like a relation to hitting a limit, or like coming up in friction, basically, between the fulfillment of your, like, maintaining homeostasis and just vibing, and then having to do something about it, right? Of course, the baby, like, what the baby has to do is scream, and then it's an adult that has to come in and take care of it, or someone has to do caretaking, right? But for people, who are ostensibly agential in the world, or try to be, right? You have to be that adult. and here I'm thinking about, like, I don't know, I would much rather binge watch TV than do any of a number of things, right? The amount of days in a week that I just don't want to get out of bed. Oh God. But like, it's something some part of me appreciates that if I don't get out of bed, I will just slip deeper into a major depression, right?
Yeah.
Or that if I don't, I don't know, change the oil in my car, the engine will degrade, right? But all those things are they still suck to realize. They still suck to do. And presumably it was like a whole lot of sucky, shitty things that built up in me over time, or somehow that like accreted over time, that gave me the capacity to still do them, however tenuously I may be doing them.
Yeah. And I think that's so important to think about, given this idea about the limits of fantasy and sort of what we do with disappointment, which is sort of in this model a paradigmatic experience, and it's not one that you just get over, right? It keeps happening. This is one of the great Proustian themes, really, is the way not only that reality rarely matches the fantasy that you have about it in your mind, but the time when a fantasy becomes exhausted, and the time in between kind of workable fantasies about what the world should be. I mean, that in itself is a sort of depressive condition, right? You're sort of in between cathexes.
We were talking about how the reality principle sort of emerges trailing the pleasure principle in this account. And the reality principle could be possibly understood, I'm saying heuristically, as like a adding of contours or filling in details of what was previously the unclear object of either turning towards or turning away from, right? The thing that was, the object of pleasure, right, was also unclear and is now becoming more and more constellated and coming together in this kind of kaleidoscopic way from the image of the infant. But also, too, now we're trying to think about the way in which friction to that attempt to turn, but also the thing that causes us to turn away in the first place, now is beginning to take on increasing characteristics. It's becoming populated with increasingly well-rounded, more stable objects. The reality principle is starting to also become an incipient worldview of what reality is.
Right. And Freud says this in a passage that I want to read. The increased significance of external reality heightened the importance, too, of the sense organs that are directed towards that external world and of the consciousness attached to them. Consciousness now learned to comprehend sensory qualities in addition to the qualities of pleasure and unpleasure, which hitherto had alone been of interest to it. A special function was instituted which had periodically to search the external world in order that its data might be familiar already if an urgent internal need should arise, the function of attention. This is not especially like metaphorical in and of itself, but for me, it conjures up a whole host of sort of like the idea of like the opening towards a larger world. There is that, it's not valenced in a moral sort of way here in that sort of classic Freudian way. It's like, it's just descriptive. But there is this sense of like, although the reality principle is continually disappointing, it also serves this function of so before we were turning towards, now we're turning outwards. And so the attention that once was devoted to the self is now and I almost have the sense of like one of those like sensors that turns on when something gets tripped.
Yeah, like a motion detector.
That's the
like
word that I'm looking for. Exactly. But it's hard to have anything but like really spatial metaphors.
I think part of what we're encountering here, and that's making this hard to talk about and makes Freud's like text so dense, but also bears on like the why this is a thing that is it should be this hard to talk about, right? Is we're kind of attempting to theorize as adults in language who have object permanence and subject-object duality, right? The co-emergence of space and time in the chaotic field of perceptions, unmarked by a stable inside-outside boundary that is like the landscape of the child who does not, as the word infans means, has no language, which is a tall fucking order.
Yeah. Thank you. That's clarifying. Yeah.
Which is also something important to think about when we consider that the structure of the way that he's narrating this is in a way fabulous, like a fable.
Yes.
It's a kind of narrative that I don't even think we should maybe read as Freud, thinking that it has complete veracity, complete sort of developmental fidelity, right? He's imagining something here, right? He's imagining, okay, well, attention has to come into being somewhere. I'll put it here because it would make sense. It would make sense that is before memory, which is the next faculty that he relates, right? He doesn't have the science or the observational evidence in order to really back this up. But I think that what it does for him is it allows him to perform a kind of thought experiment in what it takes to transition from a stage in which we have no faculty to enter into relation to one in which we do, right? In which suddenly, like, actually other objects are real out there. in the world. And we have to figure out how to navigate our connection to those objects, which are not under our omnipotent control, that we actually have to sort of displace ourselves from the geocentric model of the solar system, as it were, to the heliocentric model of the solar system. So this has some application to Milton, which we can talk about later, but I just wanted to get that out there.
I wanted to say, just thinking about what you were saying here, is that at both of you, in terms of like the narrative character of this, and I think, again, people who are used to reading Freud or encountering Freud through the disservice done to him oftentimes in psychology textbooks, where it's like, here's a paragraph, Freud believed this, and then this became this, and this is how the ego happens, and this is why he was proven wrong, right? That's bad in its own right, but that can bring you, when you encounter a text like this, you start reading it as though that's what this is.
Yeah.
And that's not what this is. I mean, this is a attempt to do theory in real time about things that resist easy conceptualization. And in other ways, it's also like, it is a narrative. It is a parable. We'd even call it a fable that we've submitted with similar stakes, so slightly different, like Lacan's mirror stage, to a similar kind of like...
so fabulous quality, as Rebecca said. Yeah.
But also, too, what he seems to be trying to do is like using the resources of psychoanalysis, using those three baskets of inquiry and the various data sets that he's assembled, plus his own writings. Freud is trying here to succinctly, and in a way that almost, I was thinking about like Nietzsche on Truth and Lying in an extramoral sense, right? Which begins with these little essays that begin with cosmic narratives. Freud is trying to tell an origin myth for the psyche that encapsulates the friction that the psyche encounters with its environment over time, and the way in which it moves from what he's trying to narrate here too, and this bears on our conversation a few minutes ago, right? Are the series of developmental movements where the thing that is a psyche, what we were talking about previously, like a thing that operates in a binary off-on, right? A merely reactive way, in like the mode of like the phrase tropisms of mind should be said here again, like that plant.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
To now something, there's something just moves, right? To something that now has motivation and can move itself, and can configure its objects, or can interact with objects around it through time, and with a similar sort of sense of coherence. And weirdly, the words that he uses to describe this in a psychoanalytic mode, terms like memory, or even heuristic terms like notation, also register in the narrative mode that he's giving as like I kept on thinking of your work, actually, Rebecca. It reads like a Greek myth. And like, these are muses, and this is what's created on such and such a moment, and this is what's created on the next day, and this springs from this. It has this kind of elegiac character to it.
Oh, so elegiac, because it is a narrative of, to use that overdetermined word, loss in many ways, right?
Yeah.
Or the trade-offs that get made when we enter into this state that seems governed by, and I'm going back all the way to Fechner, who was an influence on Freud, but the way that the kind of immediate prospect of pleasure or unpleasure now has to give way to other kinds of capacities. And in a way, the loss of the governing rule of pleasure is a bit tragic, or that seems to be the tone, what you describe as elegiac.
Yeah, well, I mean, the loss of pleasure is an orienting principle. I mean, I think it's, even if you hadn't given us Milton, there is this sort of like, quality of being cast out of paradise, which of course is not the only way to think of being oriented towards the other and the external world.
Not at all.
But there is this sort of sense that perhaps there is a quality of a fall.
Yeah. But also maybe a fortunate fall if we sort of look later on in the essay. The idea of the felix culpa being really important to Milton as well. The idea that actually maybe we get something that, although it's not what we expected, and we can't sort of maintain stasis in this pleasure-governed state forever, that there actually are compensations, right? Like they're not ever going to give you back what you lost, but the substitution of some other object for what you thought you wanted, it actually is is an amazing, potentially redemptive kind of a narrative, if you want to look at it in those terms.
It represents another way too, in which like the thing that we would call neurosis should be appreciated as actually an artifact of survival, as a creative,
creative and adaptive.
Yes. Yeah. And always attempting to solve a problem. Like,
it's a way of being in the world. And maybe like therapeutically, we want to intervene it because I don't know, maybe you do have to go back to our earlier examples. You do have to choose who you're going to date, maybe, or like time is running out for you to have these kids or write the screenplay, whatever it is that your high level neurotic hangups are happening to. And maybe also, to go back to that other example, the relational, like family vision of like a neurosis, like expecting that other people around you are going to change rather than you can change yourself is actually a very infantile way of thinking about it, right?
Yes.
If I just, infantile omnipotence, the kid imagines something, it gets it, right? It yells enough, eventually it gets food, right? But also there's this idea that, well, if I simply want something, it will happen. And if I simply yearn that my parents like become people that they never were purely enough, then suddenly they will become that. And I think we could say like, well, on the one hand, that's they'll die eventually, right? Or like whatever it is, you're going to work through some sort of, you're going to hit some sort of.
I didn't think that was where you were going.
What I'm saying is that at some point, something's going to happen where you got to wake up and have to stop sucking your thumb. You're going to hit some sort of limit, friction, or like real, like the hard real of death. And so maybe you do want to like alter the way in which you relate to, say, that particular hang up. But there are other ways in which, I don't know, perhaps your hopefulness and your neuroses make you a good person.
Can I take that example,
please,
to launch us into the next part of the essay and also use it as an excuse to confess that I find the next part of this really hard. And
same.
Of course, like the whole thing is an artifact of its time, as every text is. But this feels really, really yoked to what we've talked about on the podcast before as the hydraulic model that Freud is working with, this idea of discharge being really, really important. Like we've talked about it in terms of the hysterics as sort of like the expulsion of the foreign body before psychoanalysis is psychoanalysis, and it's still really operating on the idea of catharsis, of like expulsion of the thing. Is that the reason that I am claiming that this is a segue from Patrick is thinking about the child with the omnipotence of thoughts, realizing finally with the advent of the reality principle that the child has to take action. Freud is making a claim that I want to see if you both can maybe like put some flesh on these bones for us here. He's making a claim that there is always something going on in terms of what he's calling motor discharge in the context of the pleasure principle. And now with the supersession of the reality principle, he says it was converted into action. And then there's a long section on cathexes and bound cathexes and ego instincts and sexual instincts. And can we walk through that?
Please, because I go back and forth all the time about what I think this means. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there actually isn't just kind of one right way to read this. So yeah. I would love to hear what people think. Should we start with the kind of definition of thinking, which is sort of the thing that is going to tell us something about how motor discharge becomes more legible as action? And I'm thinking of, this line, restraint upon motor discharge upon action, which then became necessary, was provided by means of the process of thinking, which was developed from the presentation of ideas. Thinking was endowed with characteristics which made it possible for the mental apparatus to tolerate an increased tension of stimulus while the process of discharge was postponed. It is essentially an experimental kind of acting, accompanied by displacement of relatively small quantities of cathexis together with less expenditure, discharge of them. So that in itself is really dense to me, and I sort of have to translate it in my head as I go. So
I can intervene here, I think, to clarify some of the stuff that's happening in this, and then also and hopefully will move us on from it, because in some ways I think this is actually
Yeah, it's not the meat.
It's
No,
not, but
no.
I want just because
Yeah.
one of the things that I love about our listeners is so many of them are reading along with us. I want to not skip over this, but just like get a gloss and then get to the parts that we care about.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So to put this in the broadest possible terms, let's say that what Freud is struggling with here goes back to our initial understanding of the pleasure, unpleasure principle structure or schema as operating initially as a mode of purely reflex action, right? It is a automatic tropism. There is a reflexivity to it. You poke, it does it. And that is, above all, sort of like understood as a movement, as a physical movement. Now, as the organism develops, as any organism develops, or if we want to use that schema to think about more sophisticated organisms in general, right? We have to allow for the fact that sometimes, well, and something notably more sophisticated organisms do, is they don't just move when you poke them. And then they will also do more sophisticated things where they don't not only choose not to react, they will do things like walk away or avoid you to begin with. And then yet further, we have organisms who, instead of reacting reactively, right? I.e. like just like the double like immediate pushback, or reacting simply in the mode of like passivity, sitting there and taking it, or through some sort of like motor avoidance, will instead react by giving you language.
Yeah.
Or will sit there for a moment, take another punch, and then quickly sidestep and hit you with a right hook, right? The idea then, so it's like, how exactly, from the perspective of going from this very parsimonious reflex model of towards pleasure, away from unpleasure, can we now account for things that don't involve movement at all, or that appear to involve some sort of moment of interiority? Literally, instead of exterior motion, we have a lack of movement, and that appears to involve some sort of processing internally.
Thinking is experimental action, that phrase.
I love that
he
phrase.
uses. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's great.
Yeah.
And this is a sort of a thing. I checked some of the psychology, like context reading stuff that they were dealing with at the time, right? And there's some papers we can recommend for people who want to pursue this. But there is this kind of like tendency in some of the people that they're reading, and in the early decades of the 20th century in general, to kind of like associate this thing called thought, broadly speaking, as necessarily involving a inhibition of that reflex action. So again, we might say, actually, no, some people move while they think, right? Or in fact, moving lets them think, etc. But on the basic schematic formal level, there is the belief among many people who are doing, like, in fact, or maybe involved in this, like early theorists of psychology, that somehow like thinking is more superior than, like developmentally and oftentimes in terms of problem solving than acting, but it must come at the cost or be incompatible with this other type of movement. Now, the other psychology thing to say here too, this is the other bit of the history of science that is relevant, is that the real world template that Freud himself and that all his interlocutors have in their mind as a model for an on-off switch for something that functions in this binary mode is literally like the neuron, right?
Yeah.
And
or neuron, as they're calling it then.
Yeah, it's a single circuit that can be turned off and on. And this is why Freud, in his early work, in this book that we're going to get to actually up very soon in our standard edition series, this sort of failed attempt to produce a very material metapsychology, the Project for a Scientific Psychology, attempts to account for all mental phenomena as basically scaled up activations and deactivations of neurons and the inscription of meaning and internal events qua memories onto these neurons.
Yeah.
And he tries to take it through its paces, everything from development and on the cellular level to very abstract pathology to his own dreams.
Yeah.
And he says it's a failure.
Right.
Right. So in other words, what that failure represents and what this language here also represents and why it's so hard and I don't think actually coherent is because the lexicon of energistic buildup and discharge, right? Which is the cathexis decathexis thing, right? Cathexis is a buildup of energy, discharge. Decathexis is the release of that energy. And the theoretical presupposition or this initial opposition between thinking and action those two things are insufficient for describing what Freud wants to describe here. In other words, and this is why actually the kind of giant footnote that comes with this set of pages here, and it's literally in the text, which gets into stuff about the infant surroundings and mother-infant interactions, is such a mine, not for object relations theorists, but also specifically speaks to what would clarify what's happening in the section that's bothering us with all this energistic stuff, i.e., thinking about like early emergent objects and the dynamics of, anxiety, persecution, pleasure, control, etc. All that stuff, you can't do it through energistic work. This is also why, or through energistic metaphors, or through a presupposition that thinking and action are distinct activities. Because, one major reason that sort of ties us all together, for the child, thinking and action are not distinct activities, right? So this is all to say that this section here is basically Freud being like, I've got this hydraulic energistic model. I'm going to try and make it work.
Yeah.
I've got this opposition between thought and action that I'm sort of inherited and that I buy. I'm going to try and make that work.
Yeah.
It doesn't quite work, but the problems that animate this, as are the problems that animate the scientific psychology project from, 10, 15 years earlier, still remain, which are the real problems of how exactly does the child or does the person or does the organism build up the well springs of, let's not call it energy, let's call it a sense of stability, a sense of agency, a perception of time and its own efficacy, et cetera, to move through the world and more adaptively interface with reality. So when we're talking about those things in terms of achievements or qualities or characteristics or capacities, and not in terms of energistic numbers or quanta, we're in a better place.
Yeah. Agreed.
That makes sense. Where I suspect that we are heading, just given some of the things that Rebecca has hinted at, is one of the final passages that's about art. But I think we would be remiss if we did not make a stop at this next little bit about the sexual instincts and the ego instincts. Let's quickly consider that before we get to some of the parts of the end of this essay that are about implications and that are about, I guess you could call cultural formations, right? That are about not only art, but also education.
Yeah, which is also quite important, I think.
Yes. Okay, good. All right. So we're all on board with where we're heading. I'm going to read this passage first, though, because I think anyone who's really interested in Freud's work on sexuality will be interested in this part. The supersession of the pleasure principle by the reality principle, with all the psychical consequences involved, which is here schematically condensed into a single sentence, is not, in fact, accomplished all at once, nor does it take place simultaneously all along the line. For while this development is going on in the ego instincts, the sexual instincts become detached from them in a very significant way. The sexual instincts behave autoerotically at first. They obtain their satisfaction in the subject's own body, and therefore do not find themselves in the situation of frustration, which was what necessitated the institution of the reality principle. And when, later on, the process of finding an object begins, it is soon interrupted by the long period of latency, which delays sexual development until puberty. These two factors, autoerotism and the latency period, have as their result that the sexual instinct is held up in its psychical development and remains far longer under the dominance of the pleasure principle, from which, in many people, it is never able to withdraw. So I think that's important there for a series of reasons, but also because it marks out sexuality as this particular domain in which the pleasure principle has more every word that I'm looking for is not the right word. Heft. I definitely did. I was trying really hard not to say thrust. And also trying not to say force, but those are kind of the right words. Also, let's say that the domain of the pleasure principle, sexuality is proper to it in this way later in life.
I think part of what's going on here, and let's stipulate that we could kind of, I think, set aside some of the more intricate theoretical problems within his own models that Freud is trying to solve here in terms of developmental stages and specific things like the term, like the pleasure ego, et cetera.
Yeah.
Like that'll become important for subsequent thinkers. I think Kohut is one of these people who even will find something in it, but that's neither here nor there. And instead think about like the broader problem and the example that, as Abby is addressing, like the singular point that the example of this thing that we call sexuality in adults underscores vis-a-vis that problem. And that is that, namely, people who are adults and quote unquote normal, but also people who are adults and are neurotic, possibly more so, according to Freud, though we'll bracket that, do things and find things as sources of pleasure involving their bodies and the bodies of others, which children do not necessarily do. Do not necessarily do of their own accord, even though they may be interested in such matters. And even though, to be sure, I might like Freud would be the first person to be like, yes, children masturbate, children, like they play doctor, they do all this stuff, right? But that the elaborate character of what adults do is different in its relationship to the reality principle, right?
Yeah.
Like, you have to have a credit card to buy all that S&M gear. And like a closet to hide it when your parents come over, right? You're making these decisions that are a little bit more complex. Like a child in all its polymorphous perversity does not have to deal with the entanglements of that problem. Even if we bracket like the adult sexuality and jokes about that to the side at one moment, we just think about the experiences of these things called like latency, or more obviously like puberty, in which literally your body, or like, so if latency involves memory and things that disappear and don't disappear and developmental achievements that happen in the early years of life, right? Well, in puberty, which we all do remember sometimes all too painfully, like your body literally changes, right? The ways in which you experience pleasure and the things you do with pleasure, or the things that occur to you as being possible for pleasure, the things that suddenly seem to be of interest to you, right? Your specific like kinks, interests, whatever, those change, they develop. They appear to have a mobility, and they clearly weren't there at the beginning. So in other words, again, we're adding more textures, shadows, characters, dimensions to the objects that can be part of this pleasure-unpleasure equation, even as also the body and the internal and external sort of aspects of the subject are changing too.
I want to make what I think is, before we move on from this, what I think is actually quite a simpler point than the one that you are, which returns us to the original gloss that I was doing of lust as both pleasure and desire. And often, at least in colloquial English, like desire codes as something that is related specifically to sexual desire. And yet, there's a host of things that you can desire and fantasize about that have something to do with bodily needs, right? Because I have been dealing with laryngitis for the last while, I've been fantasizing about ice cream quite a lot, right? I'm not dreaming about it. But what I guess I want to say is that this is also an explanation for the stature of sexual desire as desire par excellence, for why it occupies a different role for human beings than our desires for other things that give us pleasure, like food, like wine. It is set apart in this way.
Freud also remarks that because there is this kind of latency period that interrupts things, that kind of relative delay of the sort of adult sexual instincts connects it more closely to fantasy, which is this other capacity we have that for him is split off and safeguarded for us. A word that comes up a couple times it's safeguarded from reality testing. And reality testing, we haven't really talked about that term, but it's this comparative process by which we check or have someone's assistance to check whether the things that we are experiencing internally map onto things that are happening externally, and whether they map well onto those things or whether they don't. And so with fantasy, it's obviously really impossible if you're going to be reality testing all the time, if you're going to be comparing what's happening in your head to what's actually going on. It completely removes the power of the fantasy, which depends on your suspending disbelief, which depends on your really, really committing to the ice cream or to the S&M or to whatever the object of that fantasy happens to be. But I just wanted to mention that because we have this subsequent passage. Just as the pleasure ego can do nothing but wish, work for a yield of pleasure and avoid unpleasure, so the reality ego need do nothing but strive for what is useful and guard itself against damage. And so what he's saying there is that, in effect, the pleasure principle never gets deposed by the reality principle. It's not that one completely yields to the other. It's that the reality principle becomes, in a way, a safeguard of whatever vestiges of the pleasure principle remain. And he has a kind of parable that's appropriate for us here, where he says, well, I think that the doctrine of reward in the afterlife, this ability to defer gratification, to resist earthly pleasures in favor of some kind of metaphysical reward after life is done, is essentially the allegorical representation of this psychic process that is happening to us, whereby the reality principle becomes, in a sense, the safeguard or maybe the captor of the pleasure principle.
This is amazing. And I love that passage. I'm so glad we've got to it. I want to say one thing about it and then also throw another theoretical sort of thing on the table that I think will help tie together some of what's going on. Freud's thoughts on religion often, they are what they are. And oftentimes by religion, he means Christianity more often than not, right? Yeah. And I think that's actually specifically revealed too when we think about not just like his attraction to the medieval church and the interest that he had in it, but just sort of the features of medieval and Christianity more generally that he juxtaposes with Judaism. Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's other scholars in here, I think specifically of Robert Paul's excellent book, Our Two-Track Minds, which is an anthropological sort of accounting for this in terms that, well, Bobby doesn't use the idea of social reproduction, but I think you might be able to too. But it's a reading of essentially, and this is Bobby reading Freud, but I think where I want to go, this is where we can read Freud, right? Is from the perspective of anthropology, institutions can get people to do wild things, right? Or wild things is the building block of a lot of institutions, right? And from a Freudian anthropological perspective, and this I think adds some heft to it for our purposes, those things in their wildness get even wilder. Let's just think about what institutions get people to do, or what institutions have historically been capable of getting people to do when there is a religious motivation or a warrant that we would call religious informing these institutional operations. We might say it would be kind of natural to think that having a good life now is a good thing, right? That maybe you want to I don't know, maybe you want to have kids. Maybe you don't, but maybe you want that option. Maybe sex, which feels good, is also a thing that is good or is a thing you want to enjoy. Right? These are all sort of seem like naively straightforward things, or they're at least things that, I don't know, like a Darwinian anthropologist might be like, well, yeah, there's an impulse to reproduce. Reproduction feels good. Of course, we're going to do that. We want, our genes want us to do this, right? And then you have something like the Catholic Church, which says, no, not only should you not reproduce, many of you need to actually enter the monasteries and the nunneries. You should mortify your own bodies. Sex is, in fact, terrible, and we're going to allow it to reproduce, and some of it must be necessary, but there's a fundamental orientation of purgation and of coming into embodiment under the sign of guilt.
Sure.
On a very basic level, it's a relationship to the body and to the social body and to sexual reproduction and to pleasure more broadly that seems to fly in the face of what is, tangibly pleasurable or in our own interests or what seems to be straightforward. And it offers rewards, though, that require an object that you can't see, An object that literally no one you know has had an experience of and come back to tell you, well, yes, it was great. Right? It's kind of amazing when we sort of think about it in these terms. So there is that, right? And think about how, like, I don't know, like, to go back to like the puberty example from a few minutes ago, like think about like growing up in a religion, like in a religious context that uses the notion of sin and not just action, but the idea of like you're thinking of things that make you sinful to like basically use things that happen to you in your mind or anxieties that you have to populate an entire landscape of what the world is going to look like or what's acceptable in the world that will have all these consequences that may or may not, well, have some degree of omnipotence or weirdness in their own right. I don't know, like, not only is masturbation bad for you, you will go to hell forever if you do it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a whole series of impositions that fly in the face of how we understand time to work or what feels good immediately, but it could be determinative, or at least could produce a hell of a lot of neuroses. The other thing to say here, though, too, and this is the second sort of conceptual thing that Freud actually articulates here in a fulsome way for pretty much, I think, the first time in his work, is a key distinction between conscious and unconscious fantasies.
Yeah.
And unconscious fantasies, or fantasies spelled with a PH, are understood to be scenarios, expectations, objects, etc. And I'm using these words with some difficulty because they're things that emerge in those earlier developmental moments where you are populating the objects or sources of pleasure with more sophisticated things.
Yeah.
So unconscious fantasies on this level are things like, like Freud's, just if I cry too loudly, I will never get fed again. Or I made my mother frown when I bit her, and now I feel tremendous guilt over this, and I deserve to not exist, right? The idea here is that later developmental stages may see us developing conscious fantasies, but those unconscious fantasies, particularly when they're reinforced by real world failures in our environment or traumas, persist in us through adulthood, and thus may also be expressed in how we experience or imagine adult pleasures and anxieties and needs. Like TLDR, I don't know. That's why there are adult baby fetishists out there in the Freudian account.
Sure. I mean, fantasies of the perfect caregiver that is also it's also welded onto the sexual fantasy. Yeah, that's a great example.
Can we talk about art and education?
Yes, let's do.
Okay, so we're nearing the end of the essay, and now we get to a portion of the essay where it seems like Freud is really doing the okay, so like what does this look like in certain domains part of what he's up to. So first he says, education can be described without more ado as an incitement to the conquest of the pleasure principle and to its replacement by the reality principle. It seeks, that is, to lend its help to the developmental process which affects the ego. To this end, it makes use of an offer of love as a reward from the educators, and it therefore fails if a spoilt child thinks that it possesses that love in any case and cannot lose it, whatever happens. Okay, so that's education without more ado.
Kids these days, they just only want an A, and they're not going to take it. They're like, fall apart if they don't.
Okay, Patrick. Sure. Okay, David Brooks over here. Art gets ranked a little more highly for Freud here and is a little more nuanced. Art brings about a reconciliation between the two principles in a peculiar way. An artist is originally a man who turns away from reality. An artist is originally a man who turns away from reality because he cannot come to terms with the renunciation of instinctual satisfaction, which it at first demands, and who allows his erotic and ambitious wishes full play in the life of fantasy. He finds the way back to reality, however, from this world of fantasy by making use of special gifts to mold his fantasies into truths of a new kind, which are valued by men as precious reflections of reality. And this is now where we need the Dilettante Army shirt that I'm going to order. That's like, and that's dialectics, baby. Right? The relation of pleasure principle and reality principle when it comes to art. Where do you want to start with these two?
So we're now in the realm of our third like basket of psychoanalysis, the applied psychoanalysis. And Freud has gone all the way from postulating that a very sort of schematic pleasure, unpleasure thing, like circuit, to now adumbrate an account not just of normality, but of apparent social excellence.
Yes.
Right? Of people who have not just overcome the like, well, previously I just move when I'm pushed. Now I have to develop motivation, to people who are quote unquote great artists, right? Or to people who do thankless, impossible professions like education. But what I want to underscore here too is that Freud understands these exceptional cases like the great artist, or these necessary but difficult vocations and persons like the educators, as responding to or as coming from the same sort of ingredients or combinatorial possibilities that we've seen earlier developmentally, and that could also play out in ways that are more traumatogenic or more causative of suffering, right? And so I was thinking, like, I made that David Brooks' crack about how like kids only ever want an A, right? But we might think for 1 second, we could use the same tools that Freud gives us to be like, well, what about the anxiety or the conditions of attachment or the feeling of insecurity that might lead someone to think that, well, they can only ever, it's not that they'll lose love, but they can only ever have a little bit of love if they're perfect. And note how the same tools and the same account of this could be used to generate that. Or think about Freud here being like, well, our friend, the artist who mines their own dissatisfactions to produce touchstones that everyone thinks are beautiful because it illuminates the same shared hole in their hearts. I mean, what about like the person who's like the artist whose whole thing is like offensive, aggressive comedy, who like throws things like a Gallagher who throws watermelons at people in the audience, right? Who tells difficult truths and dies poor, right? That could also be a narrative that we could imagine along these terms using these ingredients.
Yeah, well, and to elaborate a little bit on that point, I want to sort of bring up a dangerous word for Freud, which is seduction, but I'm not thinking about the seduction theory. I'm not thinking about any of that stuff. But I just want to point out that education and seduction share an etymology, right? So educere is to lead out, and seducere is to lead astray.
Mm-hmm.
So that duality that you were just pointing out is embedded, at least in the English language word for education, right within the concept itself. And I think that that's going to be important when you do a little bit of Milton, because there's a question that poses, right? Is what's going on in the temptation scene a seduction or an education? And what's the difference between those things? Could you have a heroic seduction? Is this failed education? What's happening here? And so I think that this actually gives us a way of thinking about education not merely as a progress towards a certain object, right? The acquisition of the ability to do calculus, but also as a kind of psychic education as well, right? And those things are kind of happening simultaneously. So dual in that sense as well. And the second thing is that I wanted to talk a little bit about the passage you read about art in terms of where he ends up there.
Yeah.
That thus, in a certain fashion, the artist actually becomes the hero, the king, the creator, or the favorite he desired to be, without following the long roundabout path of making real alterations in the external world. But he can only achieve this because other men feel the same dissatisfaction as he does with the renunciation demanded by reality. And because that dissatisfaction, which results from the replacement of the pleasure principle by the reality principle, is itself a part of reality. And to link this idea to what's going on in the little education section, there is something about the artist's sort of enactment of his fantasies, right? Sort of concentrating them in actual kinds of material objects like literature or paintings or whatever it happens to be, that allows these fantasies not only to be experienced internally, but shared in some way. And Freud says that the value here of that is that you get to bypass actually having to become the king, the hero, the explorer, in favor of giving people, and I'll go back to that idea of thought as experimental action,
Yes.
a way of running through almost a counterfactual simulation of what might be going on in other lives, right? So sort of the window model of literature, right? We look through literature in order to understand something about how it is possible to be, not necessarily something about ourselves. So that's also a perfectly legitimate reason to read literature. But the reason why the artist can do this, can make that kind of bypassing move, is because other people feel the same dissatisfaction with the world, the same gap between what we want and what we can actually have, and the terrible necessity of the reality principle. So I happen to think that Freud is maybe just a little rigid about his determinations of what constitutes affecting the external world. The relationship, I think, between what happens in art or what happens in affect and what happens in action is not, as we've discussed, so clear cut. But I think that it's really suggestive because it allows us, sort of like extending this analogy, this description a little bit, to think about what kinds of interpersonal relations, what kinds of larger communities or solidarities could arise as a result of ratifying our dissatisfaction with the world. And that in itself, that comparative move, looks a lot like reality testing.
Yes.
So what Freud has almost talked himself into, although he doesn't quite get there in this argument, is that art is a pretty good way of reality testing, which is very counterintuitive.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Can I ask you one question?
Yeah, sure.
When we were conceiving this episode, you were like, I want you to read Milton. And we have kind of invoked this a little bit throughout. But can you just, can you draw this out and make really concrete why for you thinking about these two principles of mental functioning, why Milton and Paradise Lost in particular helps you think about that?
The thing that I find really, really generative about thinking about the pleasure principle and the reality principle in context with particularly the seduction in the garden, the temptation in the garden, as Milton tells it, is that it is not, I think, a perfect, quote unquote, illustration of these principles. But what it does offer is a scene of education by which someone moves from innocence to experience, and essentially has to seduce herself into doing that.
Yes. Okay.
The serpent is almost, he's an aid to that, right? He speaks in these rhetorical patterns that Eve sort of takes into her rhetorical patterns as she goes on and convinces herself to pluck and eat the fruit, which is the way that Milton describes it. But it's also a story about how this actual seduction or education process, and this is kind of the tragic thing, does not in any way destroy or elide the memory of this capacity for pleasure. And it's about their coming into this kind of dialectical relationship. So you have that tragedy, right? Well, we've lost paradise, but you also have, and this is maybe that unexpected compensation, the way in which Eve sort of coming into the faculties of judgment. And this is not, by the way, something that I necessarily think Milton intended, but that she essentially gets a window onto what it might be like to imagine a world that is better than paradise, which is hierarchical in Milton's description. Her first sin may not be the eating of the fruit. It may be fantasizing that she can do better there can be something better than this order in which she is subordinated to her husband, Adam. There may be some way in which the world they live in which she's always just a step below, is not a world that is perfection, right? Yeah. Paradise is not a perfect place. So that thought, once you have it, is in a way the folly before the folly, but it is also what is most right for education. That ability to imagine the world differently, which fully becomes available to her in the wake of this decision, as terrible, I think, as the poem tries to argue that the whole thing is. And the last thing I'll say about that is the Paradise, the seduction in Paradise, book 9 of Paradise Lost, begins with Eve arguing to Adam in the first marital spat on record that they should actually work separately to tend the garden because there's too much work for two people. And Adam worries that she's vulnerable to temptation because they've been warned that this might happen. And Eve says, in words that reflect the arguments that the young radical Milton made in tracts like Areopagitica, which is anti-censorship, that in effect, if I don't have the freedom to do this, to make this choice, to go into places where I might make the wrong decision, then Eden were no Eden, thus exposed. Then I would merely be exposing this paradise as something that was not, in fact, paradise. And that is a yield.
Amazing.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to sit with that for a minute. We set out to talk about the pleasure principle, and in some ways we have ended up talking more about the reality principle.
Yeah.
And that may have to do with Freud. That may have to do with the structure of this essay. That may have to do with us as well. And the moment that we, collectively are at in our various lives. I want to end with the final passage from this piece, which really makes some gestures at contingency, more than Freud even normally does, and of the just in the same way as we start out trying to talk about the pleasure principle, where do we end up? There is a line break, and there is really a note to the reader. The deficiencies of this short paper, which is preparatory rather than expository, will perhaps be excused only in small part if I plead that they are unavoidable. In these few remarks on the cyclical consequences of adaptation to the reality principle, I have been obliged to adumbrate views which I should have preferred for the present to withhold, and whose justification will certainly require no small effort. But I hope it will not escape the notice of the benevolent reader how in these pages too the dominance of the reality principle is beginning. Rebecca, dear benevolent reader, thank you so much for being here with us. Before we go, can you tell us a little bit about where people can read the new issue of Dilettante Army, procure the It's Dialectics Baby t-shirt that I have been teasing, and also what classes you might be teaching? Where can we read you in the near future?
Sure. So the just released issue of Dilettante Army is called Tiger Beat Theory, and is essentially about the life cycle of youth, and what that concept does or doesn't do for us in the contemporary moment. And because the original Tiger Beat magazine had a kind of merchandise arm, we decided we would build one ourselves. So the store is a joke, but the merch is real, and you can order a That's Dialectics Baby t-shirt. You can. We also have one that says Levity and Gravity.
Nice.
There are totes. There are fanny packs, everything that you could wish. Also, between Gramsci and Teen Vogue, which is sort of our aesthetic, that was one of the catchphrases that made it onto the roster. Where to find me? So I have some pieces coming out in Book Forum in the Nation, one on the wonderful overlooked writer Marguerite Young, and another on a recent epic poem in translation that is written by a Swedish Sami poet called Ednan, which I highly recommend taking a look at. The poem, not necessarily the review. And what classes am I teaching? So right now I'm teaching a class on Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights. And in the summer, I will be teaching one course on the second installment of Proust. So not too late to hop on the train if you would like to. Never too late for Proust in time. And the other class that I'll be teaching this summer is a survey of Marxism and literature.
Awesome. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us. It was such a pleasure.
Truly, you were fantastic. This was a great time.
Thank you. You as well. Anytime.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Rebecca Ariel Porte. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.